Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Justice in Action, Police Reform and Racial Justice. My name is Cheryl Parker, and I'm the director of the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility at Marlene Meyerson, JCC Manhattan. The goal of this session and the others in the Justice in Action series is to focus on issues of critical importance in New York City life, particularly those that have been affected by the events of the past year. We encourage you to ask questions during the session. You can do this by answering them into the Q&A, and we'll select as many as possible to answer toward the end of the program. A few final notes before we get started. First, I want to offer a big thank you to our program co-sponsors, Avodah, B'nai Jeshurun, JTS Handel Center for Ethics and Justice, the National Council of Jewish Women New York, Repair the World Brooklyn and Harlem, and SAJ, Judaism That Stands for All. Next, I want to let you know that the JCC is committed to giving all of you the opportunity to hear a variety of perspectives on the issues that we'll be discussing. We think that civil dialogue is essential to a thriving democracy. However, we want you to know that the views and opinions expressed by our co-hosts and guests do not necessarily reflect the official position of the JCC. And finally, for those of you who want to listen to this program again or pass it along to a friend, we'll be sending you a link to a recording tomorrow. And now I'm going to turn the session over to the JCC's social justice activist in residence, Ruth Messenger, who will tell you more about the program and introduce our guests. I hope you enjoy the program.
So thank you very much, Cheryl. As those of you who are regular listeners know, my co-host is Dennis Walcott, who hopes to be joining us soon. He's a little bit delayed this evening, but he is the distinguished head of the Queens Public Library System, and with a long career in city government, running the city schools, serving as a deputy mayor, and et cetera. But I want to talk about tonight's program at a little bit more length than I sometimes do introducing a program. But before I do that, I want to state the obvious for those of you who've been following us and working with the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility. We are in the last 5 weeks of a major city election. There has been information from the JCC on the election. There will be 3 workshops. You only need to come to one starting this Sunday to explain ranked choice voting. And I urge you, if you have any questions, to dial in, but I mostly urge you, if you are by any chance not registered to vote in the primary, to do that before May 28th. And if you are registered, take note of the fact that you can vote by absentee ballot, you can vote early, or you can vote on primary day, June 22nd, but please vote. Okay, we are talking about police reform and racial justice. Now, this is an issue which has had so much attention of so many different kinds, really not just in the last year, although that's where all of your energies may be focused, but for many years. So as a veteran of New York City government, I can tell you that for years, the question of how big our police department should be, what the range and scope of its work should be, what kind of training do police officers need, how do we deal with the endless various forms of police action that have sometimes seemed to be and sometimes have been racially discriminatory. So it's a long standing issue. In the last year, it got particular and dramatic attention from really very different sources. First of all, we all saw, and I mean that quite literally, the emphasis on saw, the murder of George Floyd. And while there were many people, particularly in communities of color, who, as distressed as they were by watching those 9 minutes, did not frankly see anything surprising or unusual. And yet there were people who had no notion that a police department or a police officer could behave that way, even though they had heard about many other cases by name, but they somehow had a new awakening when they actually saw that action on screen, which is one of the things about the era we're in now. Police behavior is now much more visible. So at the same time as that was rousing concern just from a broader general public about what police do, or what some police do some of the time, we had a powerful move, not just in New York, elsewhere around the country as well, to address the problems of the police department, or of some police departments, or some police officers, however you would like me to word it, by looking at the budgets of the police department. And that led to a movement which had the catchy name, for good or for bad, of defund the police, which various people took and used to mean various things, good and bad. I think our guest tonight will have a lot to say about that. And I will also, on my judgment, it was a catchy phrase which might have focused attention on some of the serious problems with funding the police departments, but also created a kind of, I don't know, groundswell, back wave, which was not necessarily helpful to the changes that people are trying to make. So we saw this as a perfect topic for discussion, influenced by the last year in many different ways, and directly relevant in New York City to where we are now, because in these elections in June and November, we know we will be electing a significantly new city government, a new mayor, a new controller, about 2/3 of the city council new. And one of the questions that we know is before those candidates and will be before those office holders is, what should the budget of the New York City Police Department be? What should the tasks of New York City police officers be? And what changes should be made? So we thought that that was a good topic for discussion. And we have two really extraordinary guests. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to each of them, and I'm asking each of them to tell you a little bit more about themselves when they start. I've known Cary Lazar White, I hate to say this, but since he was younger, but he's been a serious and committed activist since he was quite young, looking for ways and places to make a difference. He may give you a longer trajectory about how he got to where he is now, but he is the founder and director of an extraordinary program based in Harlem called Brotherhood Sister Soul. And he will explain to you a little bit about the origins of that program and its overall work, as well as starting to share with you its perspectives on this question of police reform and racial justice. And our other guest is Arva Weiss. Arva's had a long and distinguished public service career. I've known her in various different roles, from working on microfinance to helping young people get involved in and connected to government over a long period of time. But she is now, and has been for many years, the president of the New York Urban League, an organization with a extensive American history, but an organization known for its thoughtful commentaries on matters of public policy and public events. So Arva, by virtue of seniority, why don't you give a longer version of your own biography, talk about the Urban League as it is today, and a little bit about the recent work I know you've done on police accountability.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for the invitation. And I look forward to this conversation with my good friend, Cary, to talk about, as you mentioned, a conversation that made its way into everyone's living rooms as a result of COVID-19, and people were not able to look away. And so it became a hot button issue in people's conversations at their dinner tables, and whether at their churches or their synagogues. But this is something that we need to talk about, not only in terms of what happened, but what's the way forward. As you mentioned, I have the incredible privilege of serving as president and CEO of the New York Urban League. I have been in this role for over 10 years. I'm the second woman to serve as the CEO of the Urban League in its over 100-year history. And as you mentioned, our work has been over generations helping Black folks to make transitions. And so initially made that great transition during the Great Migration, folks moving from the South to the North and trying to figure out where to send their kids to school, where they could find a job, where they could find housing. Some folks were even looking for a husband, and we were able to provide them with all of those things. And work in the areas of education, employment, and advocacy. And education is getting young people to and through college, giving out over $20 million in scholarships through our Whitney M. Young Scholarship Initiative, helping individual New Yorkers to find jobs, and also working in the field of advocacy, working with a very robust Young Professionals program, which works with young people who give back to our programs, who staff our historically Black college and university fair, who give over 15,000 hours of community service to the Urban League on an annual basis. And as you mentioned, one of the things that I've been involved in over the course of the last year, which has really been one of the most challenging roles I've ever had, is serving as a co-chair of the New York City Police Department's Reform and Reimagine Task Force. I served in that role with Jennifer Jones Austin of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies and Wes Moore from Robin Hood Foundation. We spent literal hours actually at one police plaza at different precincts throughout around the city, had conversations with community members, got cursed out in a church, had conversations all over the place, just really talking in very real ways, had conversations with labor leaders at the NYPD and saw all these different ways and places, spoke with the community, the CCRB, which is the Civilian Complaint and Review Board, about their role, and just really dug in about some of these issues. And I think we did have some success, but there's a lot more work to be done. And I'll end there.
Okay, Carrie, your own story, a little bit about Brotherhood Sister Soul, and the beginnings of your take on this question of the police department.
Thank you, Ruth, for the introduction. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you and with my friend Arva. I am the executive director and co-founder of the Brotherhood Sister Soul, which is a comprehensive youth development organization that's based in Harlem. We work in 3 interconnected spaces, wraparound comprehensive youth development work, really helping young people to define a moral and ethical code, who they are as men and women, their role in becoming active citizens and social change makers, really wraparound youth development that goes from the age of 8 until 22, international study in Africa and Latin America, after school care, activist training, and college guidance, just to name a few. The second piece of what we do is that we train educators on our model across the country and even internationally. We've had formal programming modeled as far as Brazil and Bermuda, and we're currently working with school districts in Boston and in Washington, D.C. to implement our model there. And then the third piece of what we do is our organizing and activism. We are a justice organization that works in the space of criminal justice, racial justice, gender justice, class justice, and the interconnection of these issues. It's been at our core since our founding 25 years ago. We create spaces for young people to have their voices heard now, participate in the social change movements that we're all seeing throughout our nation right now. We know that it's always been young people at the forefront of social change movements, the women's movement, the rights movement, Black Power movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, to name a few. It's been young people at the forefront, and that's the same now. And a lot of our young people have been working very hard on the interconnected issues around, quote, criminal justice that involve decriminalization of marijuana, an issue that's only enforced in Black and brown communities, essentially. Last year, over 90% of all those arrested for marijuana charges being Black and Latino, when of course, people of all backgrounds, Asian and white, also use and utilize marijuana. Also very involved in the efforts to shut Rikers Island, the stain that it is on the city of New York, really an abomination that continues to reopen and exist. The population there being almost exclusively Black and Latinx. They worked on the issue of raise the age. Until just 2 years ago, New York was one of only 2 states that prosecuted children as adults. And yes, they work on the issue of what does justice look like and fair, equitable, constitutional policing look like. They were very involved in the effort to call to attention the unconstitutional racist practices of stop and frisk that saw basically all the Black and brown men in our organization stopped and frisked at gunpoint in Harlem and the South Bronx, including myself several times, brought attention to these issues. Did artwork, were named litigants and named witnesses. And so really being young people who called to attention the school that policy was. And when Mayor de Blasio announced the dropping of the Floyd case, he had on the stage with him at the time the police commissioner, Time Corporation Counsel, and Nicholas Pert, one of our alumni members, who really wrote the definitive op-ed on how much of a violation stop and frisk was in his life that Bill de Blasio said changed his entire perspective on the issue. So that's what we see as our role, to call attention to the injustice, the immorality of so many of these policies, and then create the space for young people to be at the forefront of articulating a vision for change.
So I'm going to ask you, I have a little story to tell also, but you said that you'd been stopped several times. And so I want you to tell the audience who may not all be, in a sense, personally familiar with this, what that means when you say you were stopped, where were you stopped? What happens when you were stopped? What was the level of respect or disrespect, I guess might be the best words, that you were shown by people in uniform?
Under the law, when you stop and frisk a person, it's called the Terry stop. You have to have an articulable reason of why you stopped somebody. It has to be reasonable to those who observe the stop. That's the standard under the law. Over the Bloomberg years of the administration, on average, 700,000 people were stopped a year. These stops resulted, the stated reason for the stops was to get guns off the street. In 0.01% of the cases, guns were found or some type of weapon. 0.0. In over 90% of the cases, people were completely innocent. Just stop for walking down the street, stop for going to the bodega, stop for walking across the street. A lot of interactions with the police begin with things that everybody on the Zoom has done thousands of times in their life. So 99% of the people arrested for jaywalking in New York City are Black and Latinx. Everybody on here has jaywalked in their life. 94% of the people stopped for marijuana, Black and Latinx. Again, most people on the Zoom have used marijuana in their life. And 85% of the people stopped in frisk fair events as well. What people have to understand is that the interaction with police are on things either that are ticketable offenses, and I'll get to the personal in the second, Ruth, but ticketable offenses that almost every New Yorker has committed. Open containers, they're not stopping people in Central Park who are attending Shakespeare in the Park and drinking rosé. They are stopping people in Harlem and the South Bronx with an open container. So it could start there. It could start with riding your bike on the sidewalk. There were less than 10 stops in Park Slope for riding your bike on a sidewalk, over 2,000 in Bed-Stuy. So it often starts with what's a ticketable offense, or it starts with nothing, simply walking down the street. I was riding in a cab with a close friend of mine. We got into the cab. We had gone to a wine store to buy wine. We're going to a house party to bring it to the person's home. We were on 137th and Lenox, got into the cab. Cops pulled us over a block later, gunpoint, took us out of the cab, gunpoint, put us against the cab, gunpoint, frisked us, asked why he was from Florida and I was from New York, wondered whether we were engaged in some kind of interstate drug trafficking. He happens to currently be the lead counsel for the for the NBA Players Association, and I was the other person. They run your ID, they run your background, still cuffed, still at gunpoint, and they say, have a good night and walk away. That's it. Other times, simply walking down the street in Harlem on 136th Street, not far from Arva's offices, and cops swarm you, put you up against the wall, and tell you, hands against the wall, frisk your pockets, touch your person. So what I think everyone on the Zoom should think about is how you would feel if your son or daughter was put down the street once and had the cops run their hands over their body at gunpoint, what your response would be to that, how you would feel if it was you one time. Often this results in brutality, which we've seen with our young people, beyond that, in terms of beating people, in terms of trumped up charges, marijuana being the highlight. But Nicholas Purr, who I talked about earlier, I think his issue really captures it. He was 18 years old. He was sitting outside of the McDonald's, celebrating his 18th birthday. Police came up, threw him down on the ground, put a gun to the back of their head, handcuffed him. And when they pulled out the ID and saw that it was an 18th birthday, they dropped it on his back and wished him a happy birthday as he was cuffed at gunpoint. So these are the kind of interactions that folks have who are Black and brown in this city, 3 times, 5 times, 15 times, 20 times. And you have to think about what that does to the psyche of the person experiencing it, but also what it says about the psyche of police officers for perpetuating it that widely and that broadly. This is a policy that, Bloomberg defended until he decided to run for president, and Ray Kelly still chooses to defend today. And the reason was that they said if they didn't do it, blood would run in the streets. And of course, what we know is when the policy was greatly retracted, not ended, but retracted, what you saw in New York City were the lowest levels of crimes and murder that the city had ever seen. So that's the reality of the policy. It's why it was deemed unconstitutional. And it's just such a deeply visceral, violating experience to go through.
And if I can just add just one piece to that, yes, to everything that Kari just said, I think that the other piece in terms of the psychological damage is literally the time, right? So you're on your way to school and you're delayed and you're late. You're on your way to work and you're late. You're on your way to meet people and you're late. Literally the time, the cumulative time that this has taken out of the lives of not only African-American men, but African-American women. And I think that one of the most poignant conversations that I had with the police commissioner when I first started into this role, working on the Police Reform and Reimagining Commission, is he talked about that wanting to change the conversation, the dialogue between African-Americans and police officers, and talked about how a group of young people might see a group of police officers, and that's not a welcoming sight that makes them think I'm safe, but you know what's going to happen next. And the difference in our conversation was he thought that was for that emotion would come from a group of young people, and my response was that would come from a group of middle-aged Black women. The fact is that the reaction that Black people as a whole have to the police is a result of those many times that we've had those negative interactions over time.
I mostly want the two of you to speak to this, but just in the powerful way that each of you is trying to engage the audience by asking them to imagine what this might be like. I am going to tell one story because it's the time and way in which I, as a white woman in New York, first understood this issue, or early on in my tenure as borough president, so that's about 40 years ago. As one of the things I did, I met in small groups with the staff of the borough president's office. Excuse me. Many of the people in the borough president's office were lifetime civil servants. They were not people that I had hired. They were there doing a job, and I wanted to get to know them. And so I staged these meetings, about 10 or 12 employees at a time, and basically just said, like, okay, you're working now for the borough president of Manhattan. Some of you live in Manhattan. Some of you live elsewhere in the city, but the problems are similar. So I'd like to have you go around the room and talk to me about, like, what are the city issues that most bug you, most concern you, that you'd most like to see an elected official work on? And one of the women at the table, and I should note that backing up just what Arva said, most of the employees, because so many of the employees in city government were African-American women between, let's say, 35 and 55. They were probably 80% of the people in the room. And one of the women said, Madam Borough President, very respectful, we all have precisely the same problem. And I thought that was a little odd because I didn't know them well. I didn't think they'd been asked this question on a daily basis. So I said, no, people can share whatever problem they want. And she said again, no, we all have the same issue. And so it seemed unlikely to me because I didn't know any better. But I said, well, what is the issue? And she said, we all spend our work time between 3 and 5 o'clock every afternoon waiting to hear if our sons made it home from the subway without being stopped. And I've never forgotten that, because that was the take of everyone. She was absolutely right. That was the take of every woman in that room. They all had sons, mostly given their ages, going to high school or college. And they all waited every afternoon because the likelihood, as Kari indicated, more likely than not, was that their sons would be stopped on this same route from the subway station to their homes. And that was when the issue first became real to me. And I think it sometimes takes that kind of personal story or some of the numbers that Kari shared, or Arva's indication that it's everyone in the family, everyone in the Black and brown community is affected by this kind of behavior. So Kari, you want to pick up with what that change has meant as you've seen it, but I think more importantly, where the organization, the organization, the Young Advocates from Brotherhood Sister Soul, if you've raised the question of police reform and racial justice, where would you be coming down? What would you like to see? What would you like to hear from candidates? What would you like the next city administration to do?
From the perspective of our young people and the issues that we work on as an organization, the reason why we are and have been a strong advocate for the movement to defund the police is because, we believe it's a misuse of funds, and we believe it's the wrong answer to an array of societal issues. I think it's important to your introduction, Ruth, that we're clear on what defund the police means in terms of the movement in New York. So first, there are kind of three groups within defund the police. The first are the abolitionists, which sometimes are grouped in. Abolitionists don't believe in policing in the modern form that we have in this country. The defund the police group is also split into two groups. There are some who are advocating for a percentage decrease and a reapportioning of those funds into other areas of service. And then there are others who are advocating for a much more substantial decrease. You see this in terms of the mayoral candidates. So the citywide defund the police movement that many were involved in, including Communities United for Police Reform, and we're a part of, the number everyone heard was a demand of $1 billion in reduction. And so when people hear that, sounds massive. That's a 16% reduction in their budget. That's it. It returns their budget to where it was during the Bloomberg years. I actually think it should be more aggressive than that. But the point is that $1 billion and a 16% cut, returning to the Bloomberg years when people thought the number was already massive and huge, is not reflective of the kind of cut that then the chorus starts to say, well, what will happen without police? What will happen to the city? You're talking about shrinking the footprint of the police and reimagining how policing should be used. So the estimate is that over 90% of the time the police are called in this city, they are called for nonviolent offenses, traffic offenses, homeless services, mental health crises. The idea is that you should not be calling the police for homeless service issues and mental health crises issues. You should be calling other people. The idea is that you should not be spending nearly $500 million on police personnel in New York City schools. $500 million. That's more than every city in the country, other than several, spends on their policing. So the idea is you shrink the footprint, you decriminalize marijuana, you decriminalize sex work, you send social workers and violence interrupters in many situations, you deal with fare evasion in a different way, and by shrinking the footprint, you then reallocate resources to other parts of the city to respond to those issues. You also hope what that does is allow police to maybe do what people are so concerned about. Police last quarter cleared 50% of homicides in New York City. 50% they solved. Last year, they solved 30% of shootings in the city of New York, 30%. So do you want the police focused on shootings and murders and rapes? Or do you want the police officers focused on homeless services, ticketing people, marijuana, and open containers? And that's really the question before you get thrown by this word defund. And I have no problem with it. I mean, I think it's important that we think about all movements for social change. At some point, their language terrified people. Black power terrified people. Women's liberation terrified people. So people are afraid of a word or it makes them uncomfortable. It's the wrong focus. The focus needs to be on reimagining what the footprint of policing should be and what the response should be to all these societal ills. We're sending in police officers, they're categorically not trained to deal with these issues, whether it's truancy of young people, homeless folks, or people facing a mental health crisis. And that's where the conversation needs to be, that we're reimagining what policing looks like in the modern era, because the effort to reform police has never worked. And that's the other thing that we have to talk about and really look at, that a chokehold was illegal in New York, and that didn't stop Eric Garner from being choked to death. The interactions with George Floyd in Minneapolis were illegal under Minneapolis law. He still died. Reform is not sufficient. We also have to stop the engagement with George Floyd. What was it? Passing theoretically a counterfeit $20 bill. What was it for Eric Garner? Selling Lucy cigarettes. The police don't need to be involved in those types of situations. Those two men would be alive. And that's what the concept is, of really reimagining and not just looking at budget numbers and not just looking at quote unquote reform, but what should policing look like in an equitable, fair society? What we know is it shouldn't look like what it currently looks like.
Maybe you'd like to run for office soon. I just want to mention Dennis Walcott, my co-host. Dennis, the issues are, I've introduced you already, the issues are well known to you, so just feel free to jump in at any point. Kari, that was really eloquent, and we're going to come back on several of those points. But Arva, would you say a little bit more both about the I forget what it's called, but the panel you were on, the commission you were on, who appointed it, and where it got to? Your interchange with the police commissioner was instructive for all of us because he so clearly did not understand even the dimensions of an impact of the problem. But who appointed the commission, and what else was it able to do, if anything? You're muted, Arva. You're muted.
I was trying to block out some of the sounds of Harlem, but I'm back. And before
in my living room, the sounds are of my great grandson, who's 16 months old. That's when I go.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. So before I answered your question about the Reform and Reimagine Commission, I did want to thank Kari for reminding us the fact that Black Power did scare people. Martin Luther King was a scary communist, right? And so Diane Nash was, a frightening teenager, and it was because of the work of those individuals that we have the liberties that we celebrate today. And so just reminding us the fact that defund the police, it's okay. It's okay if it makes some people uncomfortable, because we're not going to have any real change unless there's a level of uncomfort that's there. So thank you for bringing that all to our attention. And I do think it's important for us to realize that defund the police does come in, different buckets in different places. At the New York Urban League, we believe that police do have a role. We think that it's important for people if there is a crime that happens, that there's somebody that they can call. But one of the things that happened during our process is that we said that, too often people call, the people at 3 o'clock in the morning, they're not going to call the New York Urban League. So they're going to call the NYPD, right? And so many police officers are not trained. They talk to us about the fact that, they're not at people's houses for, Christmas dinner. They're not at people's houses to celebrate, a birthday and anniversary. They see people at their absolute worst. We said we understand that, but you cannot perceive everybody at their absolute worst at every time. And there has to be some way of being able to de-escalate such that, why is it that there's so many interactions with Black people that folks come out dead? Right. A lot of the work that we did with the Reform and Reimagine Commission, as I mentioned, was literally looking at their policies. We did a lot of work, deep dive, looking at their framework that they put together for their discipline matrix. We had a lot of conversation, a lot of pushback on the discipline matrix. We were looking at the CCRB. There was a whole set of recommendations that were put together. The David N. Dinkins reform plan that we thought had a lot of great movement, but obviously there's still more work to be done. A really significant memorandum of understanding was signed between the NYPD police commissioner, saying that they would actually live by the code that was put together in the discipline matrix, rather than, as we know, the police commissioner can actually override any recommendation that's made around police misconduct, but that he would only in the most extreme of circumstances try to override those. Actually sat in some discipline committee meetings and listened to police officers go through and talk about some of the issues that had been faced. And it was, like I said, it was very educational, but there's just so much more work that needs to be done. And so then our national organization has recently released a 21 pillars for police reform. And in that reform package, one of the things that we've been working on as a national organization is around the George Floyd Policing Act. And so we think that there needs to be greater accountability, that there needs to be a national registry, so that if a police officer basically has had misconduct in Indianapolis, he can't just, go to Chicago and continue to do the same thing. So we're really pushing for that national registry. We've talked a lot about both hiring and promotions. The fact is that the New York City Police Department is diverse. It actually is. There's a whole lot of people that, look like community members that are there. But let's have a conversation about who are in the supervisory levels, right? Who are the top 400, 500 people in the police department? Who are the ones that are, making the final decisions? And then it's a very different conversation about diversity. So I just really encourage folks who are more interested in recommendations to look at the 21 pillars, because it goes into more strategic suggestions for how we can reform the police.
Fantastic. Dennis, you want to jump in here with your own reflections on this?
So first, let me apologize. I had a board committee meeting that went really long tonight, so I do apologize for that. And also just to give my greetings to two great people. Ruth, you're great always, but two great people who I haven't seen in a good while. So, and then I think the articulation of the issues by both have been really concise and to the point. I mean, it's the balancing act. And I think the way I heard Kari lay it out, about the reallocation of resources, the reallocation of personnel, the reallocation of responsibilities of who does what, I think are extremely important, that really has gotten some attention, but it hasn't really drilled down to the people that really need to hear it and understand what people are talking about. The only thing that I would say to add is that it really has to be done at a level where people can separate out that, yes, there is crime. Yes, there is more crime in New York City compared to last year and the year before, but not allow that then to detract from the conversations that I heard take place just now and how one can achieve. And I mean, just the rates of arrest, the rates of solving crime, I think people don't have a clear sense of that either. And I think to me, those are important points to really drum home so people are able to get currency. And I think right now, as you know better than I do, Ruth, especially, in a primary season, things get really boiled down to the political soundbite. And this is more than a political soundbite. And I think the people who have been out there really doing the job and articulating the causes need to continue that, because this will go beyond the political soundbite period of time and the impact. And even taking it out of New York City, you just look up in Rochester. You don't even have to go anywhere else. And what happened in Rochester, I mean, go to any city and how people try to always basically rationalize someone dying, which is unacceptable. And so I just want to say thank you for the folks who are here in laying out the cause and how we keep this momentum going as far as changing the system itself. And, you asked me, I mean, I come from both sides of the coin. And I've said this in a variety of public settings where I've had a son who was both shot and my wife and I had to live. He lived, but he was shot by someone who had an old beef with him many years ago, and just had a community gun. And I had to reconcile that, but at the same time, not go to the extreme that all kids out there, all teenagers are bad. And how do you have that balancing act in the mind of others as far as what reform means? So, I think it's just an ongoing discussion that has to drill home as far as policy reform that impacts the system overall.
Kari, you looked like you were about to jump in. I have a couple of technical questions later, but before that, Kari, your statistics were extraordinary, more than I knew. But I guess I just wanted to add and make sure that all of you agree, but it's my impression that not only are police assigned to a variety of activities where we can't justify, or I can't justify that those should be the jobs of the police department, but where it seems to me that the police officers are totally untrained for those situations. And therefore, you can only assume that bad things are going to happen. The one that I know is practically the only one that you didn't mention, Kari, but I remember actually from working with my local precinct police when I was a city council member, I learned that whenever there's a domestic violence complaint, the police are the people who are called and they show up in the house. Now, I don't know about the people on this listening to this webinar, but I promise you that if anybody's ever been in the middle of a domestic violence situation of any kind where one partner is actually damaged, hurting, or threatening to hurt the other, it takes the most extraordinary level of skill to figure out what you might do to intervene in a constructive way. And instead you have uniformed police officers with weapons on their hips who have no idea, and as far as I could tell then, and I'm going back a ways, but had received no training in how to deal with a situation like this. And so from my point of view, their presence was terrifying, but from their point of view, when you could actually get them to talk about it, they felt totally inadequate to those situations. And so unfortunately, they kind of resorted to what they know best, which was threatening people.
Yeah. Go ahead, Kari. Were you going to say something? No. I think one of the most poignant moments for me, as I mentioned, we did a number of different focus groups with individuals who were talking about their interaction with the police, giving concrete suggestions on ways in which the police and community could work more closely together. And it was those people who gave examples exactly of that, of being in domestic violence situations and having the police be the first people that arrived on the scene, from just blatant disregard to, one police officer and his partner who were talking and marveling about how amazing it was that the man could actually hit the woman as much as he did because he was so old. And it was just painful to hear this comment and this commentary. I believe that training around sensitive issues is higher in the police department. I think that there's more work that's been done in that area. But as you said, Ruth, they're not trained. They're not trained in this. So why is that the call that they're receiving at all, right? So why aren't we calling on social workers? Why aren't we calling on, as Kari mentioned, violence interrupters? It is just a form and a function that has gone to the police department that just has no business being there. And that's the reason why the call for defund the police needs to continue to ring out and become even louder, because there's just some roles, some places and spaces that they just don't need to be in.
And Kari, I know you were, I want to hear you in a minute, but I know you were coming up with different segments of the quote defund movement, but I think that's a whole piece of what you were talking about, right? Is take away money that's being used to send police officers into situations where somebody else would do the job better, and use that money to upgrade other forces, from violence interrupters to social workers. Is that correct?
I mean, it's like the old saying, Ruth, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every solution is a nail. This is a city that's funded the police with $6 billion. I mean, that number is just astronomical. There are 35,000 police officers in the city of New York. It's a certifiable army. There's 10,000 police officers in the city of Los Angeles. There's 35,000 in New York City. When every time these conversations are had and people say, well, what else will we do in domestic violence situations? Because they might get violent. And so you need somebody there who's armed, so you have to send a police officer. What will we do in homeless services situations? Because some of homeless people are also mentally ill and they may become violent. What do we do when a youth is truant? Because to Dennis's point, a young person may carry a gun. Well, if you fund sufficient interactions that are different than the police, if you provide proper funding and training of people, then you will have other tools and other solutions. And so you've seen a massive bloating of police department budgets, militarizing of police officers. There's a famous moment in a 60 Minutes interview with Ray Kelly when he puffed out his chest and talked about the fact that the NYPD had the ability to shoot down a plane. The question is, A, why should the police have the ability to shoot down a plane? And B, who gives that order, pray tell? That's supposed to be the business of other entities, not NYPD to shoot down planes. I mean, it's just an extreme example of where we've gone with policing. So I think part of it is reimagining, as I said before, I think it's the key word, what we should do as a civil society for all of the situations that police are sent into. And there are police chiefs around the country who have actually spoken out of this issue, including in places like Houston, and said, we don't want to get those calls. That's not our job. We're not trained to do it. To your exact point, Ruth, we don't know how to handle it. It puts us in bad situations, and somebody else should be called in these situations. But the de facto is the police. I came home the other evening. I live off Lenox Avenue in Harlem. There was an extremely mentally ill person on my stoop with the band clearly recently released from the hospital, half praying to me, half talking to me aggressive. I live in a brownstone with other people with children. I felt I had to deal with the situation, get him off the stoop, as he both threatened me and prayed to me. What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to call in that moment? If I call the police or 911, they will come and there will be a brutal engagement. I should be able to call somebody for this 70-year-old Black man who's on my stoop in bad shape, and somebody else should be able to deal with that, as opposed to calling the police and having 6 officers surrounding him. I chose not to engage with him, removed him from the stoop. Somebody else called the cops. I looked out the window, 10 minutes later, 6 cops around him, hands on the guns. It's not the right approach. And so I think on one level, we're constantly talking about policing, but we can't separate policing from the rest of the criminal justice system. Right. And so the fact that we continue to put away overwhelmingly Black and brown people in prison is because that's who the police are engaging with. And in turn, we have over 2 million people in prison, disproportionately Black and brown. So again, what kind of society do we want to live in? And we just keep pushing this down the road and not doing the work that needs to be done to change how we engage on these issues. And that I think is the issue. Is there the political will, the community will to do this in a different way. Otherwise, we're going to keep having the same conversation. And police in Black communities have been a problem since the beginning of police and the beginning of Black communities. None of that has changed. This is not new. It's just that people have cameras. When my father came to Harlem in 1963, it was the same issue. When my great uncle and great aunt lived in Harlem in the 30s, it was the same issue. Langston Hughes wrote about it. James Baldwin wrote about it. Gwendolyn Brooks wrote about it. You know, Lorraine Hansberry wrote about it, and we're still writing about it today.
Arva, go ahead. You're about to speak. No, you're muted. Arva,
Yeah. I was just agreeing with the with your comment, and just really thinking about the number of incarcerated people. The New York Urban League recently produced our State of Black New York. We hadn't done the report in a decade, and the national office does our State of Black America. So there's states of Black Philadelphia and Chicago and Atlanta, and we looked at the State of Black New York. And one of the statistics we looked at education, we looked at employment. One of the statistics in criminal justice that really hit me hard was the fact is that African Americans and Latinos are less, actually just African Americans are less than 17% of the population statewide, but we're 92% of the prison population. And so it just underscores what Kari was saying about that there is definitely an inequality that's at play right here. It was underscored by what happened with George Floyd. It was underscored by the shooting death of Breonna Taylor, of the death of Ahmaud Arbery, but it's been happening for decades. And looking at those appalling statistics, we have to make a change. We have to make a shift, and it can't be around the periphery. I believe in training. I believe in support, but it has to be a more fundamental and a big moment that we need to make a shift in order to create real change when it comes to racialized policing.
So if I can ask this, and I'm hesitant because I don't know what I missed the first half an hour.
Don't worry, just jump in.
But you both have the opportunity to change two things in the beginning of your administration. What would those two things be to get to that fundamental change that you're talking about to impact the system in New York City?
And answer carefully, because we're playing this to all the candidates.
I know that all the candidates said that they would select their own police commissioner, and that's pretty standard. I would actually encourage people to think about whether they would consider a civilian police commissioner. I think it would be an interesting take. I think it's to be able to actually have an external perspective on policing, and to be able to talk about and look at some of these structures in a very different way. So I would challenge whoever would come in as mayor to really look at who their selection would be for the police commissioner. And then the secondly is obviously to look at the budget. And that has been something that we've talked about over and over and over again. And the fact is that the police department's budget is bloated. And so let's figure out what are the places and spaces that we can move some of the things that are currently in policing to other more appropriate places. So those would be the two things that I would take on.
Kari?
I think the issues that I've spoken to already, I think they can be summed up in 2 words, but I'll explain a little bit more. So the first is shrink. This is an issue of labor. This is an issue of 35,000 police officers. I don't think a police commissioner can tackle it, though we need a far better police commissioner than we've ever had. We have to reduce the number of police officers in this city. We have to reduce the budget substantially. And we have to tackle the issue of labor. I mean, you're talking about training tens of thousands of people. So there are labor issues that one of the great enemies to any reform in this is the police union and the inordinate power that the police union has. Bill de Blasio ran on transforming this issue. The police turned their backs on him. He's never touched the issue again. So, you have to deal with the police union. And I understand, Dennis and Ruth, you were both in government. I understand how complicated an issue that is. I'm not saying one can wave a magic wand. If any of the candidates say that, clearly they don't understand the complexity of the issue. But if you're saying the things that I would change, I would tackle the issue of labor, reduction of police force, tackle the police union. And then the second is the reimagining word I've mentioned, which is with that funding, I would reimagine the both interaction with New York citizens in all the ways that I talked about. But part of the reimagining is also decriminalizing an array of things that will push us to think differently in this city, number one. And number two means that the police can't interact on those issues. So there's a lot of talk about decriminalization of marijuana, but the things that continue to be illegal, smoking when driving, smoking in front of a public housing project, smoking inside of a public housing project, smoking near a school, smoking in a public park, who do we think is going to be arrested for those things? That's still a ticketable offense, as one example. A second, which is a much larger issue, I think that the access to public transportation should be free. So why is it that you can drive on the roads for free and you can park on the street for free, but you can't ride on a train for free? And if it was legal to ride the trains for free at maximum and at minimum for all children and all people who are economically distressed, then the issue of fare evasion would no longer be this top 10 issue of engagement with the police. And so why is it that wealthy people over 65 get a decrease and so many young people still don't get that in the school? Mean by around fare evasion, let's deal with fare evasion so the police are not engaged in that matter. So there are a lot of issues like that, but it's in simple kind of language, I would say shrink and reimagine.
There was a great question, Dennis, because you had great answers. I'm mindful of the time and I have an obligation to our listeners. So I'm just very quickly going to say one question, which I don't know the answer to, so one of you maybe can help, is, has the NYPD officially been stripped of qualified immunity? That's one question. And the second question is whether you know if all of the candidates that are running for mayor are going to keep the police accountability legislation that's been enacted so far. And then there's a question about whether or not the police should pay for the lawsuits against the police. So you don't have to tackle all three of those, but if you could help me a little bit with those three questions, we'll try to end a program that should be 3 times as long as it is.
Well, I'll take on the easy one, and that's in terms of whether any mayoral candidate will keep in place some of the legislation. What's complicated about all this effort and this work is that the policing laws that we have are a combination of federal laws, state laws, and then there's local policies, which the two of you, Dennis and Ruth, you know just as well or better than the rest of us. And so some of the things that were put in place with the eradication of Section 5A are at the state level, and so some of those things, it isn't up to the a mayor to either put into place or to take out of place. But one of the things that I already spoke about was the memorandum of understanding about the degree to which the police chief will actually listen to and abide by the disciplinary actions that are put into place and recommended by the CCRB. That memorandum of understanding is something that we want to make sure that stays into place from one administration to another. In the past, it has, and so we would hope that those sorts of things would stay in place. So those memorandums of understanding, we want to make sure stay in place from police commissioner to police commissioner. But when it comes to the laws, a lot of them are at the state level anyway.
Okay, thanks. Carrie, any pickup on that?
Sure. With regards to the qualified immunity issue, a lot of people fought really, really hard on this issue. Organizers, activists, people have been brutalized by the police, some brave elected officials. The passing of restricting of qualified immunity is hugely important, but there are caveats. There were a couple of big loopholes. And so while it bars the use of qualified immunity, if you bring that, if you bring charges against police officers for search and seizure, it doesn't for racial profiling, and it doesn't for suppressing protesters, just to use 2 kind of big examples. So it's certainly a win, but it's not a complete win. Just as a reminder, New York City has settled for over $1 billion in damages from police violation in the last 7 or 8 years, $1 billion. And there was a very high threshold because of qualified immunity. So imagine how much they would have had to settle for without qualified immunity, right? Only 36 of 35,000 police officers ever had to contribute. So that's just a scope of what qualified immunity did. And I think some of the history of qualified immunity is important. You had the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. That provided protections for Black people in the South because during Reconstruction, there was so much violation of Black people's civil rights as we emerged from slavery and began to establish political and economic power, that the Klan rose, and much of the Klan were police officers and mayors and local officials. So the Civil Rights Act, the Ku Klux Klan Act, protects people and allows them to sue the government because there was government interaction with that suppression. So it was actually a civil rights law that allowed Black people at that time, now more broadly, for people to sue individual actors of the state. That was taken away in the 1960s because of civil rights movement. because of protests where they didn't want individual police officers being held accountable as they went in to bust heads, sick dogs, turn on water hoses, and hurt Black people who were protesting. So the whole idea of qualified immunity, so much of this you can't look at without looking at the civil rights law and the issue of race in this country. So it literally tracks Reconstruction and civil rights in terms of its placement to protect police officers. So is it a win that now individual police officers can be sued for their actions in the city of New York and other places? Absolutely. Is it sufficient? Absolutely not. But it certainly was a win that was important. We have to recognize our wins, but it's insufficient to tackle the kind of rampant systemic racism in police forces. And to Arva's point, and again, so many Black writers have written about this, a diverse police force doesn't stop that from happening. And we've seen that from killings all around the country and here in New York, that Black and brown police officers also commit atrocious acts on Black and brown citizens. And so race is not the only issue that's in play here, but issues of power, issues of manhood, issues of, people exerting control over another human being that go beyond issues of race.
And yet it's still
Go ahead,
racialized.
Arva. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, and yet it is still racialized policing, right? So that the issues, once police officers come together, you're bleeding blue, right? People hear that term, you're bleeding blue, rather than it being about being Black or white. However, the policing is still racialized because, as Kari mentioned, you don't get summoned for sitting on your couch in your suburbs, but if you're standing outside at NYCHA, then that's when you receive that summons.
Right. No, look, I think unfortunately this program is only an hour long, and I, at least for one, feel overwhelmed. But from my point of view, you were just the right guest for Dennis and I to have. You've heard, talking to the audience now, an extraordinary array of efforts on the part of actually two individuals, an organization and a commission to address these issues. And yet both Arva and Kari are saying those efforts, those organizing efforts are significant, but they're insufficient to really begin to dismantle some of the elements of the existing structure to make change and improvement that will address some of the statistics that you heard, that will think about how we might best use that $6 billion, presumably not all of it in the police department going forward. And that's what's meant by what Kari said was shrink, but what people are talking about when they use the term defund, they're talking, most of them, not as Kari said, not all of them, but most of them are just talking about can we make that number smaller and think about better and other ways to use police officers and better and other ways to use some of the money that gets saved. So these are complicated issues, as I said at the beginning, I think probably well addressed at this moment in time, but I think all you could get from this webinar was a set of the dimensions of the problem and the critical importance of making changes that are far-reaching, that are systemic, that look at all of the problems of staffing and training and budgets, and as Arva and Kari were just suggesting, at the culture inside the department that needs attention. And we may very well come back and do a further program, and hopefully you guys will stay connected, but this is a critical issue going into this campaign and this year, and you're all entitled to any last word, and then Dennis will close us out. Arva? No, you're muted. You're so protecting us.
On mute. I think that once again, for individuals who are interested in continuing this work, I mean, I encourage you all to visit our website, to look at the state of Black New York, to absorb further some of the statistics and the data that just really supports this argument. I think that it's really hard for people to sometimes identify with something that's completely outside of their life experience, because it doesn't feel as real, but it is very real, and it is the lives of so many of the young people, the communities that we live in, and the work that we're doing. And so I encourage people to stay engaged in this fight. We're a year into COVID, and only a year away from what was a really terrific verdict in the Derek Chauvin verdict. But as we know, 2 weeks later, we're right back in this. And so we know that the arc of justice, that the long arc bends towards justice. And we hope that you all will continue to be involved and engaged in our work.
Thank you. Kari?
Ask folks to think, critically and systemically and personally about this issue. So that the issue of policing in our country that is done in a racist and systemically oppressive way is a systemic issue. And so the solutions have to be systemic. You can't see what's happening all around the country and all throughout New York and deal with thousands and thousands and millions of people who experience this and not realize that we need systemic solutions. And so when people start talking about fringe solutions or just training or just some kind of outside reform, it's insufficient. And we're going to continue to have this problem, and we're going to continue to have this level of brutality against some of our fellow citizens as long as we don't tackle this issue. So I think all serious thinkers on this, I encourage you at the Mayor's Forum to push folks on this. I hear, Dennis, that this is a time of one-sentence sound bites, which is very, very frustrating. But we have to push people to think big about the issues facing our city, the issues of homelessness, the issues of having the most segregated school system in America, of low-income housing. They're an array. But one of the leading issues in the city is the continual brutality of the police towards some of its citizens. It can't continue. And there has to be another way to engage in this city. We have to find a different solution.
So I want to thank Arva and Kari, because in my half an hour participating in this, I've learned so much already. And the education and the history, I think, has been extremely important. But more importantly, I want to thank you for your leadership. You guys have been there for a long period of time, continue to fight and talk about it in a way that'll hopefully allow system reform that you've been advocating for. So personal thank you to both.
Okay, thank you both. This was extraordinary. People who are on the webinar will get notice where you can get the recording of this evening, which I think many of you might want. I'm personally going to try to get someone to help me write up some of the statistics that Kari offered seriously for their shock value, Kari, and talking to candidates. And there is a lot to do. This is a reasonable month to raise all the things there are to do and to think about how we get from here to the next city administration in January with a commitment toward real and systemic change, and in all of the ways that Kari just mentioned, and probably then some. So I want to thank you both. Those of you on will get a link to the recording. You'll get information about the Urban League, about Brotherhood Sister Soul, and about the workshops for ranked choice voting, which start on Sunday. And Dennis and I will be back next month, hopefully for at least a few minutes to celebrate Juneteenth before we go on and talk about another problem or two. And if you don't know what Juneteenth is, look it up before next month. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Cheryl and Austin and Sam.
Thank you.